In today's video, we will again be looking at tanks from less represented nations that need to be added to War Thunder, with this video looking at Polish tanks of the World War II period, for which we have a decent number of vehicles, a notable achievement considering Poland was conquered in the first months of the war, and thus didn't produce their own tanks for the duration of the war. Like with other Eastern European nations, Poland could be added as part of an Eastern European/Warsaw Pact tech tree, or as its own Polish sub-tree, though under which nation this would be I am unsure. Also, like with Finland, if Poland has access to foreign tanks that it used in World War II, we will have a very large sub-tree indeed, which would include French tanks like the R-35, British Cromwells, American Shermans, Soviet T-34s and many more. The first Polish tank we will be looking at is the 7TP, a Polish light tank developed from the British Vickers 6-ton tank, which is already included in the Finnish sub-tree. The 7TP stands for Polish 7-ton, and this designation is used for most of the Polish tanks in this episode. There are two variants of this tank, unofficially known as Dwuwizowe or double turret, and the main type, the Jednowizowe or single turret. Apologies if that was mispronounced in any way. In this episode we will be looking at the single turret design. The main armament consists of one WZ-37 37mm gun, which was a licensed produced variant of the 37mm Bofors gun, which in-game on Swedish tanks has a penetration of 41mm at 500 meters when using APBC shells, which is more than enough to deal with most lower tier tanks and is competitive versus other tank guns. In addition to the main armament, it is armed with one WZ-30 7.92mm Browning machine gun in a coaxial position. Armour was relatively light at 5 to 18mm, with the whole front coming in at 10 to 17mm, the whole sides at 9 to 17mm, and the whole rear at 6 to 9mm, while the turret armour is 15 to 18mm for the front and 13 to 15mm for the sides and rear, while the bottom of the 7TP is 5 to 10mm and the roof being 8 to 10mm thick. The armour isn't the worst in the world, but is obviously not going to withstand serious hits, though some glancing hits may be bounced if you are lucky. Mobility is decent, if not spectacular, with a top speed of 20 miles per hour or 32 kilometers an hour, good enough for getting around, but you're not necessarily going to be winning any speed races against other vehicles. Crew complement was 3, consisting of a driver in the hull and the gunner and commander in the turret. Overall, the 7TP is a decent starting tank for Poland, especially at 1.0 where it will likely be added, as it has a decent gun, okay if not spectacular armour, and decent mobility if not the fastest vehicle in the world, and I think it would be a very good start for a Polish sub-tree. Our next tank is what is usually referred to as the 9TP, though this wasn't a designation that was actually used by the Polish military at the time, and seems to be more of a post-war invention, with its proper name being something along the lines of 7TP Improved, or Strengthened/Protected 7TP. For the purposes of this video, I will primarily call it the Improved 7TP. The original 7TP was to be replaced in service by the 10TP and the 14TP, but as these were still being tested or in development, it was decided to try and upgrade the last batch of 7TP tanks that was still to be produced in early 1940. At first this was done by merely fitting a test vehicle with the new Saura CT1D diesel engine, which gave higher average speeds, better cooling and was better able to deal with obstacles. While testing was still going on, it was decided to look at other ways to improve the 7TP by methods such as increasing the armour, which led to two proposals being presented. One by the Armoured Weapons Technical Research Bureau, or BBTBP for short in Polish, and one by the PZNG Studies Bureau, or Study Bureau of State Engineering Works. Apologies if these names seem off or if I've mispronounced them, I've been using Google Translate for these, but the original Polish spelling should be on screen. The BBTBP design envisioned a more radical change and potentially offered a much superior vehicle, with a new welded hull, a lighter engine, lower hull, redesigned drive shaft and only required one radiator. while still having up to 30mm of armour with little to no weight gain on account of the weight savings. The only real downsides were the fact that the new engine was a more flammable petrol engine, and the fact that these major changes would delay starting production of the new tank. The Perced Inji design, on the other hand, was much less radical. Armour was still to be increased, with the frontal hull and turret now 40mm thick, the hull sides up to 25mm thick, and the turret sides up to 20mm thick. This is obviously a massive increase to the existing armour, doubled in some cases, making this a much better protected tank. In addition to these changes to the armour were the use of wider tracks for ground clearance purposes and new gearboxes from the C7F tractor. However, weight was now increased from 7 to 10 tonnes. And while there were proposals to reduce this with welded armour among other things, as things stood it decreased the max speed to 29 km an hour or 18 miles per hour. Ultimately, despite the BBT-BP design being a much more modern and effective design, the Perced Inji design was ultimately the one chosen to go into production, as it would be much quicker to put it into production and used the existing Saura CT1D diesel engine, which was to be produced in Poland as the Perced Inji 155. By the time this decision was made, it was the summer of 1939. Now what happened next is a little unclear. The most common story that most people are probably familiar with in some form or another is that perhaps up to 13 of these improved 7TPs were made, usually quoted as 2 prototypes and 11 regular vehicles, and that these were all lost in fighting during the Siege of Warsaw. However, other sources state that only 2 were ever made, with a few even saying only 1 mild steel prototype was made, which obviously wouldn't have been all that great in battle anyway. It is also possible confusion has been caused when a 7TP was used in experiments with the Saura CT1D diesel engine, which was fitted with extra weights to simulate extra armour that was planned to be fitted in future. Personally, I believe the theory that only 1 or 2 prototypes were built, or that only 1 testbed vehicle was used, which would explain the lack of physical evidence of the improved 7TP, made worse in the event of Poland deliberately destroying the prototypes or testbed vehicle to prevent capture by the Germans. Now, this does sound somewhat plausible, but also makes it less likely the tank could be added to War Thunder. Assuming this vehicle was added, since at the very least it seems at least some tests were carried out that could aid in reproducing the tank, I would suggest placing it at a battle rating of 1.0 to 1.3, as while we have a much improved vehicle, it is still at the end of the day a light tank still armed with the same 37mm gun as the regular 7TP, while also being slower. It would still be a welcome addition to a Polish subtree, however, and I think it would be a pretty popular upgrade to the existing 7TP. Our next tank is the 10TP, which was a Polish prototype tank capable of travelling both on tracks and on wheels, an idea that was somewhat popular in the interwar period, the idea being that it enabled a tank to travel quickly by road before fixing tracks when going cross-country. Another advantage was that this saved the tracks from wear and tear, decreasing how often they would need changing or replacing. This tank came about from Polish attempts to buy the Christie M1931 tank, with negotiations seeming to go well until Christie got cold feet, either worrying the design would be copied or that he would get into legal trouble of some such, which resulted in Poland's purchase being refunded. Undeterred by this, Poland instead set about designing their own tank based off of the Christie design. In many ways, the design was better than the M1931 they had originally intended to buy, as the 10TP was armed with one WZ-37 37mm Bofors gun and one 7.92mm machine gun in the turret, with an additional 7.92mm machine gun in the hull, while the M1931 was solely armed with a machine gun. As can be expected from a fast tank, armour is relatively thin, maxing out at only 20mm, making this a very vulnerable tank indeed. Mobility is understandably pretty good, with a max speed on tracks of about 50 km an hour or 31 miles per hour, while on wheels it would be 75 km an hour or 46.6 miles per hour. Bear in mind the engine only produced 210 horsepower, but was supposed to produce 246 horsepower, so it's possible a better engine could have been fitted if accepted into service. I also suspect in-game the 10TP would be fitted solely with tracks, as fitting these in real life would take 30 minutes at a minimum, and usually longer than this, though a 31 mph top speed is still a pretty good speed, only being slightly slower than the BT7. Lastly, the 10TP is manned by a crew of 4, consisting of a driver and machine gunner in the hull, and the gunner and commander in the turret. Unfortunately for the 10TP, like with many designs of its type, the wheel-cum-track system was found to be pretty pointless, as the wheeled version of travel only worked on paved roads and prohibited off-road travel, while changing to tracks took too long and there were still general issues of wear and tear. That's not to say the tank was a complete failure, as experience from the 10TP would be put towards a new tank, the 14TP, a purely tracked tank that was about 60% finished by the beginning of 1939, but not finished when the war started, with the prototype and its designs being destroyed. As for the 10TP in War Thunder, it's possible Gaijin wouldn't add it as only one was built, which is understandable, but if it was added, I would suggest it be added at a battle rating of 1.0 to 1.3, much like the improved 7TP. My reasoning for this being because of the very thin armour and still being held back from higher battle ratings due to the small caliber gun. However, if used in conjunction with the 7TP, I could see this being very successful as a scouting or flanking unit, using its high speed to quickly get around the sides and rears of enemies, sowing destruction and confusion in its wake. Like I said, I understand why it might not be added to War Thunder due to its prototype status, but I do think it would be a very fun tank if included. Moving on to the Polish tank destroyers, we start with the 20mm armed TKS tankettes. Tankettes essentially being small tanks, with an emphasis on mobility over armour protection. As you might guess, the main armament of these were 20mm cannons, or more specifically the FKA WZ-38 20mm cannon. The armour penetration isn't the best at 20mm at 500 metres, but of course in the lower tiers, engagements will likely be at closer range where penetration is better, not to mention you can rapidly fire up to 5 shots before needing to reload. I haven't found a traverse angle for this weapon, but being in a casemate, I can't imagine it will be too great, and so you will likely need to use this as either a tank destroyer, or you could use it as a regular tank but with much more caution. You will be aided in the tank destroyer role by the fact that the TKS is only 1.32 meters tall, smaller than the Jagdpanzer 38-2 or even the Romanian Marischal. Armour is not particularly great, maxing out at 10mm thick, barely enough to protect against machine gun and splinter damage, let alone actual tank shells. Mobility is okay, having a top speed of 46 km/h or 29 mph, which is good for moving to new positions or flanking enemies. The crew consists of 2 members, this being a driver and the commander, which just makes the TKS even more vulnerable, as only one crew member needs to be knocked out to kill the vehicle. Overall, I would like to see the TKS added at 1.0, as I can see it being a very successful tank destroyer, and even an okay tank if used by an experienced player, and its fast firing cannon could easily cause major damage amongst enemies. We now come to the TKS-D, which was a tank destroyer developed from the C2P artillery tractor, which was itself developed from the TKS tankette. Armament consisted of one WZ-36 37mm Bofors gun, which was an anti-tank version of the Bofors gun as used in the 7TP and other tanks as the WC-37. Based on the Bofors 37mm in game, it would seem it is capable of penetration of 41mm at 500 metres when using APBC shells. In addition, the gun could traverse horizontally 24 degrees both ways and -9 to +13 degrees vertically. The armour is not that good to be honest, being around 4 to 6mm thick, so like with other vehicles with this type of armour, it is best not to rely on it at all except for splinter and small arms protection, and to be honest I wouldn't even trust it with that. To make things worse, the crew looks to be very exposed, making things even worse on the protection front. I haven't found an exact max speed, but I would think it would be broadly the same as the TKS or TK3 tankette based vehicles, with a top speed of 46 km/h or 29 mph. The TKS-D has a crew of 4, consisting of a driver to the right of the gun and a gunner and commander on the left, with a 4th crew member sitting at the rear. Overall, this seems a pretty good vehicle, being small enough to conceal itself relatively easily, while also having a decent gun, if not good armour. Personally, I could see this being added at battle rating 1.0 to 1.3, and despite its shortcomings, I think this would be a very good vehicle to play in the lower tiers. The next tank destroyer is the TKD, an experimental vehicle that involved a modified TK3, which was outfitted with a WZ-25 Pokisq 47mm infantry gun, turning this into a fairly capable self-propelled gun. The WZ-25 is capable of firing APHE, HE and canister shells, making this a versatile weapon capable of dealing with many targets. Unfortunately, it doesn't excel at armour penetration, only having a muzzle velocity of around 365 meters a second, and only being able to penetrate 25mm at 750 meters in testing, with the plates used supposedly being low quality plates. This would limit its effectiveness, though not to the point of uselessness, especially at short ranges where it will be much more effective. Lastly, the WZ-25 could aim -12 to +23 degrees vertically, and had a traverse range of 4 to 8 degrees depending on the sources used. Armour is not particularly good, with the fighting compartment being completely exposed, apart from the gun shield, which itself is only about 4mm thick. The rest of the vehicle is barely better, maxing out at only 8mm, meaning the armour of the TKD will barely protect against machine gun fire or splinters, so should definitely not be relied on. Mobility is decent, with a max speed of 46 km an hour or 29 miles per hour, while also using 170mm wide tracks versus 140mm tracks for the TK3, meaning this vehicle should have a slight advantage off-road. The crew complement is another cause for concern, as there is only 2 crew members, one driver on the left of the vehicle and the commander on the right, making this vehicle laughably easy to knock out, even with a basic machine gun. Overall, the TKD wasn't a great success, with only 4 being produced, and it might not fare much better within War Thunder. If it was to be added, I would suggest a battle rating of 1.0, as it would be very vulnerable to enemy fire, while not particularly well armed compared to other tank destroyers. So that's it for today's episode. I know it is a lot of low tier vehicles, barely getting out of battle rating 1.0, 1.3, but if a Polish subtree is added like with the Finnish one, there will be plenty of vehicles to help fill the gaps between the early Polish vehicles and the Cold War vehicles, and I think a Polish subtree would be a very fun addition to War Thunder. I'd also be interested to hear which of these tanks you would like to see added to War Thunder first. I personally would quite like to play the improved 7TP or the 10TP, as these are basically the pinnacle of Polish tank development in the early war period, and if the invasion of Poland had taken a little bit longer or had started a little bit later, we could perhaps have seen these vehicles in service. And of course the only reason we didn't was because, well, the invasion of Poland happened. If they had been given a bit more time, they could have been very capable vehicles. So anyway, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll join me for future episodes looking at Polish and other tanks. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.